Number 1. At 22 years old, Jake found himself working as a janitor at a small daycare center tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills. His duties included cleaning up after the kids, organizing supplies, and ensuring everything was in working order. But the most unsettling task was always going down into the basement, a dark, cramped space used for storage. The daycare center, located next to a small community church, had an old, eerie charm. Though the center welcomed families of all kinds, the building itself felt ancient, as if it held memories from long before it became a place for children. Jake's boss, a grizzled older man named Frank, would often leave early, leaving Jake to close up the place alone. On this particular Friday evening, after everyone else had gone home, Jake locked the doors and started on his final task, bringing up the holiday decorations from the basement. The basement had always given Jake an uneasy feeling. It was low-ceilinged and poorly lit, with just a few dim bulbs casting long shadows across the floor. During the day, small windows let in some light, but now, in the dark of evening, those windows were just black squares on the walls. As Jake made his way down the narrow staircase, the air grew colder. He could see his breath in front of him. Reaching the bottom, he switched on his flashlight and started stacking the dusty boxes filled with holiday decorations. He was eager to finish up and get out of there. As he hauled one of the heavier boxes towards the stairs, Jake froze. He could have sworn he heard a faint laugh echo from the far corner of the basement. He paused, listening. The sound was distant and muffled, like it was coming from behind a wall. Jake shook his head, convincing himself it was just his imagination. But as he continued working, the laugh came again. This time louder, followed by a soft, whispering voice that sent a chill down his spine. It sounded like a child. "Is someone there?" Jake called out, his voice trembling slightly. Silence. He scanned the room with his flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. The basement was filled with old toys, stacked chairs, and forgotten boxes, but no sign of anyone. The whispering returned, closer this time. It felt like it was coming from right behind him. Jake whipped around, but there was no one there. His heart pounded in his chest. He began checking every nook and cranny, looking behind boxes and under tables, but there was no sign of any child, or anyone for that matter. Just as he was about to leave, something caught his eye, a small red ball rolling slowly across the floor, coming to a stop right at his feet. He stared at it, frozen in place. He hadn't seen that ball move before, and there was no way it could have rolled on its own. The whispering started again, this time louder, clearer. It was unmistakably a child's voice, repeating the same phrase over and over, but Jake couldn't quite make out the words. He felt a presence behind him, something cold and unsettling. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. Jake didn't wait to find out what it was. He bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, and slammed the basement door shut behind him. His heart raced as he leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath. But then, from the other side of the door, he heard it, a soft knock, followed by a child's giggle. He didn't know what else to do, so he called Frank. In a shaky voice, Jake explained what had happened, but Frank just laughed it off, telling him it was probably just the wind or the old pipes. But Jake knew what he had heard, what he had felt. Frank told him to lock up and go home, saying he'd take care of it in the morning. Jake reluctantly did as he was told, locking the basement door and finishing up his duties as quickly as possible. But as he was about to leave, he heard it again. A whisper, this time coming from right behind him, as if someone was standing inches away from his ear. "Come play with me," the voice whispered. Jake spun around, but the room was empty. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, desperately trying to lock the front door and get out of there. As he finally turned the key and stepped outside, he swore he saw a small figure standing in the window watching him leave. He didn't come back the next day. In fact, he never went back at all. He quit the job over the phone, telling Frank that he couldn't handle working in that building anymore. Frank didn't argue. He'd heard stories from past employees too. Months later, Jake learned that the daycare center had been shut down. The reason? Several parents had reported their children hearing whispers from a friend in the basement, a friend who wasn't really there. To this day, Jake can't shake the memory of that voice or the feeling of being watched. And every now and then, when he's alone in the dark, he swears he can still hear that faint whisper calling out to him from the shadows. Number 2. Blackwood Inn was a charming old hotel nestled in the countryside, full of character and history. From the outside, it exuded a warm and welcoming aura. Guests often commented on how cozy and inviting the place felt. However, beneath its pleasant exterior, there were certain areas where the atmosphere shifted, becoming heavy and unsettling. One such place was Room 7, located on the top floor. There was something about that room that felt different from the rest of the hotel. Every time I had to clean it, I would sense a strange pressure, as if the walls were closing in around me. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating, and there was a persistent ringing in my ears that only faded once I left the room. Whenever I had to work there, I made sure to keep the door wide open, and I always felt a sense of relief when I finished. Little did I know, Room 7 would become a central figure in our story. Within a few months of moving into Blackwood Inn, my family began experiencing things that defied explanation. It started with small, almost dismissible occurrences. Heavy doors that would swing open on their own, even though they had been fitted with automatic closers for fire safety. We would be walking through the hallways, expecting to see someone come through the door, only to find no one there. But it wasn't just the doors. At times, we would feel sudden gusts of wind, powerful, as if someone had turned on a large fan directly in front of us, even in rooms with all the doors and windows shut tight. And after the wind subsided, the air would be filled with a distinct smell, a gingery aftershave that none of us recognized. The first major incident that made us realize something was truly off occurred one evening in Room 7. A couple, Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds, and their 10-year-old daughter, Emily, were staying in that room. After dinner, Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds went to the bar for a few drinks, while Emily, bored and tired, decided to head back to the room to watch some TV and relax. Everything seemed fine until another guest, who was also in the bar, approached my parents and asked if someone was staying in Room 7. He had heard screaming coming from that direction. Alarmed, my parents, along with the Reynoldses, rushed upstairs. When they entered the room, they found Emily sitting upright in bed, tears streaming down her face. When asked what had happened, Emily explained that she had fallen asleep but woke up to find a man standing in the room. She described him as tall, wearing a top hat with sideburns but no beard, dressed in what sounded like Victorian-era clothing. Her parents, trying to stay calm, asked where the man had gone, but Emily wasn't sure. She said he had told her to stay in bed and go back to sleep. That was when she started screaming. By the time she looked again, he had vanished. They searched the entire hotel, but no one matched the description, and the incident was brushed off as a bad dream. However, my family knew there was more to it, though we never discussed the strange happenings with the guests. We figured it was best not to alarm them. A few months passed before the next sighting. The layout of Blackwood Inn was simple, a main lobby with various rooms branching off, like the lounge, dining room, and kitchen. The bar was part of an old extension and could only be accessed through the dining room. From a particular seat in the bar, you could see directly through the dining room into the lobby and the stairs leading to the upper floors. One evening, a guest sitting in that exact spot turned to my mother, who was behind the bar, and excitedly said, "You must have a wedding party staying here." Confused, my mother asked what she meant. The guest replied that she had just seen a man in full top hat and tails walk down the stairs. My mother quickly moved around the bar to look out of the window toward the entrance, thinking the man might be leaving the hotel. But the guest corrected her, saying, "He didn't go that way. He went down the right side of the stairs." What the guest didn't know was that the right side of the stairs led to our private quarters. My parents rushed to check, but as expected, no one was there. The exits were all locked from the inside, making it impossible for someone to leave unnoticed. As time went on, other odd occurrences became routine. The sound of running footsteps echoed through the hotel, especially on the upper floors. This wasn't unusual when we had guests, as noise carried easily in the old Victorian building. But during the Christmas holidays we closed off the upper floors for family time, yet the running continued. At one point it was so loud that my father, brother, and I were convinced someone had broken in. Armed with kitchen knives for protection, we searched the entire floor, only to find nothing. Then there was Mr. Harris, a long-term guest who often stayed with us while traveling for work. On certain days, he had to leave the hotel by 5 a.m. to catch an early train to London. My mother would leave out a simple breakfast for him, and he would quietly help himself before heading out. One morning, when he returned from his trip, he casually mentioned something odd that had happened. As he left his room that morning, he saw a young boy standing on the half landing leading to the top floor. Surprised to see someone up so early, Mr. Harris greeted the boy with a polite, "Good morning." The boy didn't respond and simply turned to walk up the stairs. Mr. Harris thought it was strange but didn't dwell on it. When my parents asked him what the boy looked like, Mr. Harris could only recall that he seemed to be around 8 or 9 years old but couldn't remember any details about his clothing. This puzzled my parents because, at the time, there were no children staying at the hotel. Months later, during breakfast, a guest abruptly asked my mother, "Is this hotel haunted?" The question caught everyone's attention and all eyes turned to my mother. Playing it cool, she asked, "Why do you ask?" The guest explained that she had woken up in the middle of the night to find a boy standing in her room. She said she greeted him, but he vanished before her eyes. My mother, keeping her composure, pretended this was the first time she had heard such a thing, reassuring the curious guest that it was probably just a trick of the mind. I knew better. The final incident that truly shook me happened one night after I had bought my first expensive purchase, a watch. I had saved up for months and was excited to finally own it. That night, I placed it on the bedside table, but since the table was small and mostly occupied by an internal phone, I decided to lay the watch over the receiver, hoping no one would call during the night. I slept on the bottom bunk of a large metal bunk bed, which had a single bed on top and a sofa bed that folded out into a double on the bottom. The ceiling was so low that sleeping on the top bunk was impossible. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by the loudest clanging sound as my entire bed shook violently. It felt like someone had jumped onto the metal ladder with full force. Frozen in fear, I lay there facing the wall, unable to move. I had never experienced terror like that before. For hours, I didn't dare turn over to see what had caused the bed to shake. Eventually, the morning light filtered through the basement window, giving me the courage to look around. To my relief, the room was empty. But then I noticed something strange. The watch I had placed on the phone was gone. I searched the floor, thinking it might have fallen, but then I remembered the sound, the bed shaking as if someone had jumped onto it. Slowly, I peered up at the top bunk, and there, in the middle of the mattress, was my watch. It was as if the little boy had wanted to play with it too. Later, my mother researched the history of Blackwood Inn. She discovered that the building had once been the home of a doctor and his family. Tragically, a young boy had died there from an illness many years ago. While we owned the hotel for several more years before eventually selling it, I often wonder if the new owners or residents of the converted flats have experienced any of the strange occurrences we did. Number 3. The house on Glebe Road. I've never been one to believe in ghosts. I'm not religious and I've always been skeptical of the paranormal. But there's one experience that has made me question everything. It happened 6 years ago and I still think about it whenever the topic of the supernatural comes up. At 20 years old, I was a student in London. My lease had just ended and I was desperate for a place to live. I didn't have much money, and the idea of asking my parents for help made me feel guilty. So, like any broke student, I searched for the cheapest place I could find. I needed something immediate, somewhere I could move into the very next day. That's when I found the house on Glebe Road. It was a detached house in a quiet area, and the rent was surprisingly low. I moved in the following day, dragging all my belongings with me. The house was old and run down, but the other tenants, all in their 20s and 30s, seemed friendly enough. Despite the cold and dampness that seemed to cling to every corner, I felt reasonably comfortable, at least at first. Strange happenings. From the moment I arrived, I could sense that the house had an odd atmosphere. The garden was overgrown and eerie, with windows facing it that were scratched, cracked, and perpetually dirty. The hallway light didn't work, so the interior was pitch black at night, adding to the unsettling vibe. But it wasn't until I spoke to one of my new flatmates that I realized something was truly off. He mentioned that everyone in the house had experienced strange noises, particularly scratching on the blackened bathroom window. I laughed it off, chalking it up to a tree branch scraping against the glass. But soon I started noticing things that I couldn't explain. Every day I'd leave my room with the curtains closed, only to return and find them wide open. This happened without fail, even though the windows were always locked and I was the only one with a key to my room. Then there were the noises from the attic. At night I could hear footsteps, heavy, deliberate stomps, and even what sounded like children running and whispering. The attic was locked and supposedly used only for storage, but it was clear that someone, or something, was up there. One of my flatmates, a deeply religious man from Algeria, was unfazed by these occurrences. He didn't notice anything unusual aside from the house's general disrepair. He eventually went back to Algeria for a few months, locking his room behind him before he left. The new tenant. Not long after, one of the other tenants moved out and a room became available. I suggested the place to a friend of mine who was also in desperate need of housing. He moved in quickly and things seemed fine at first. But soon he began to notice the same eerie phenomena: the footsteps in the attic, the scratching on the windows, and the pervasive feeling of being watched. One evening, while we were eating dinner in the kitchen, he suddenly went pale. He stared out the sliding glass door that led to the garden, then jumped to his feet. "Can you come to my room?" he asked, his voice trembling. When I asked why, he just repeated, "Please just come to my room." I followed him, puzzled but not yet frightened. Once we were inside, he locked the door, sat on his bed, and turned on his PlayStation. After a few minutes, he finally told me what had scared him so much. He had seen a woman in a white dress gliding across the garden, just inches from the glass. She had vanished as quickly as she appeared. From that moment on, he was convinced we needed to leave. He was right, though it took a bit more for me to realize it. The tipping point. 2 nights later, my friend banged on my door in the middle of the night, terrified. His bed had started vibrating and moving on its own. He was so shaken that he packed up and left the next day, finding another place to stay. Not long after, another tenant moved out as well, equally disturbed by the house's oppressive atmosphere. By this point, I was also looking for somewhere else to live. The last remaining tenant was away on vacation, so I was alone in the house when the landlord came by for a routine inspection. Since the religious tenant had been gone for so long, the landlord decided to check his room. To our surprise, his room was completely different from the rest of the house. It was warm, dry, and almost cozy, unlike the damp, cold spaces the rest of us had been living in. That was when I knew I had to leave. The final night. On my last night in the house, I heard noises in the hallway. I knew I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was there with me. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the bathroom. As I left, I caught a glimpse of the bathroom window and froze. There, barely visible in the darkness, was the silhouette of a large man. I backed out of the room and locked myself in my bedroom. All night, I could hear the stomping footsteps above me in the attic. I didn't sleep. I just sat on my bed, staring at the door, waiting for the first light of dawn. As soon as the sun rose, I called a taxi and left for good. Even now, years later, I still can't explain what happened in that house on Glebe Road. All I know is that I never want to go back. And you couldn't pay me enough to do so. Number 4, the ghost on the road. Years ago, I found myself living just outside Buffalo, New York, in a secluded area along the shores of Lake Eerie. I had recently gone through a divorce and was in desperate need of some peace and quiet, so I rented a carriage house on an old estate. The property belonged to a heart surgeon and his wife, who were often away, leaving me alone to enjoy the solitude. The mansion, which overlooked the lake, was grand and stately, while my little carriage house sat closer to the road, tucked away behind a long private drive. The carriage house had been servants' quarters back in the early 1900s. Although it was a bit rundown, I loved it. There was an enclosed courtyard right outside my door, surrounded by the back of my house, an old carriage barn, and a row of empty horse stalls. It had a charming, almost eerie atmosphere, with its century-old history and crumbling features. The rent was cheap, and there was even a private beach that was practically all mine. But it was isolated, especially when the mansion was unoccupied, and the nearest neighbors were far away in their grand estates, many of them only seasonal residents. Despite the solitude, I reveled in the decaying beauty of the place. It was exactly the kind of spooky, mysterious setting that I was drawn to. I didn't mind being alone, or so I thought. One night, after visiting a friend, I was driving home around 1 a.m. The streets were deserted, and the quiet of the late hour added to the eerie stillness. As I was making my way down a road not far from my house, I noticed something ahead. A dark figure was standing close to the road, almost as if they were waiting for someone. It struck me as odd. This wasn't a place where people stood around in the middle of the night. The figure was draped in a long black garment that flowed loosely around their body. It looked almost like a shroud, with part of it wrapped over their head like a hood. The sight of them sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't the kind of attire I expected to see on anyone in this quiet, upscale area, let alone at such a late hour. As I drove closer, curiosity and concern got the better of me. I slowed down, wondering if the person needed help. Maybe it was an elderly person who had wandered away from home, confused and lost. But as I approached, the figure lifted their head and turned to look at me. I froze. It was my ex-mother-in-law. There was no mistaking it. The same gray-brown hair, the same piercing eyes, and that familiar, enigmatic smile that always made me wonder what she was thinking but never saying. She raised her hand and waved at me. It wasn't a plea for help, just a gentle, almost friendly wave. My heart raced, and I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. My ex-mother-in-law had passed away 3 years earlier. There was no way she could be standing there, smiling and waving at me. Panicked, I pressed down on the gas pedal and sped away, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. But after a few moments, I forced myself to take a deep breath. My mother-in-law had always been kind to me, even when her son wasn't. Surely she wouldn't appear out of spite or anger. Maybe I should go back, I thought, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. I turned the car around and drove down the same road again, my eyes scanning the roadside for any sign of her. But she was gone. There was no one there. Still shaken, I didn't feel ready to go back to my carriage house. The place that now felt too empty, too isolated, with its creaking floors and shadows that seemed to move on their own. Instead, I drove to a nearby all-night diner, a place where the bright lights and bustling atmosphere could calm my nerves. I sat there for an hour, sipping coffee and trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Eventually, I headed home, pulling into the quiet courtyard of the estate. But as I stepped out of the car, something felt wrong. My front door was standing wide open. The glass windows were shattered, and the door itself was cracked nearly in half, splintered from one side to the other. Someone had broken in. The next day, I found a crowbar tossed carelessly in the courtyard. Inside, a few of my clothes were missing, along with a jar of loose change and, chillingly, a kitchen knife. It was terrifying to think that someone had been inside my home, ransacking it while I was away. The isolated nature of the place suddenly felt like a curse rather than a blessing. I called the police, but they never caught the person responsible. It wasn't until hours later that the memory of seeing my mother-in-law on the road came rushing back to me. I'm convinced she appeared to delay me, to keep me away from the house long enough to avoid whoever had broken in. If I hadn't seen her, if I had driven straight home, I might have arrived while the intruder was still there. The thought of what could have happened sends a shiver down my spine even now. Today, I write horror stories, fictional tales of ghosts and the supernatural. But this story is different. It's not fiction, it's 100% true. I swear on my ex-mother-in-law's grave that it happened just as I've told it. Maybe that's why I write about the things that go bump in the night, because I've experienced them firsthand. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's to be kind to your mother-in-law. You never know when she might come back to help you, even from beyond the grave. Number 5. A few years ago, I worked the graveyard shift at a Kaiser hospital from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. My job was straightforward. Observe, report, assist visitors, lock and unlock doors, and occasionally help out when the morgue team needed access to the freezer room in the basement. It was a quiet job, often eerie during those late hours, especially when I had to head down to the basement where few people ever ventured. One night, around 3 or 4 a.m., I received a call over the radio. I was needed in the basement to open up the freezer room for the morgue team, who were about 30 minutes out. As I made my way down to the basement, my anxiety began to kick in. It was the kind of place that gave you the creeps, especially at that hour. I decided to get down there early and wait around just in case. After taking the elevator to the basement, I walked over to the freezer room. I scanned my security ID and opened the door, wanting to ensure everything was ready for when the morgue guy arrived. But as I stepped inside, I froze. There, standing in the room, was a man. He was already inside, jotting down notes as he stood next to a body that seemed to have just been delivered. Startled, I couldn't help but blurt out, "Oh my gosh." I quickly apologized for my outburst and tried to introduce myself as the security officer on duty. I even attempted to make small talk, but the man didn't respond. He didn't even turn around. He just stood there, focused on his writing as if I wasn't even in the room. The longer I stood there, the more uneasy I felt. The man never moved, never acknowledged my presence. He was like a statue, hunched over his clipboard, mumbling something under his breath. His voice was low and whispery, and I couldn't make out what he was saying. Thinking he might be speaking to me, I asked, "I'm sorry, did you say something, sir?" That's when he finally spoke. In a deep, clear voice, he said just 4 words, "Please get out." His tone was unsettling, and despite my usual instructions to stay with the morgue personnel until they finished, I decided to respect his request. "Okay, sir. I'll be right outside if you need me," I replied, stepping out of the room. As I waited outside, trying to shake off the strange encounter, questions began to race through my mind. How had this guy gotten into the freezer room without me unlocking the door? Something just didn't add up. About 15 minutes later, I received a call over the radio. It was my supervisor, letting me know that the morgue guy had just arrived and was waiting for me to unlock the basement door for him. Confused, I hurried to the entrance only to meet a different man, the actual morgue technician, who introduced himself and explained that he was there to deliver and pick up a body. At that moment, I was puzzled but not yet alarmed. Maybe another morgue team member had arrived earlier, I thought. But then it hit me. Protocol required that we never leave morgue personnel alone in the freezer room until they're finished and the doors are securely locked. I told the technician at the door, "There's someone already in the freezer room." But just to be sure, I radioed my supervisor. She called me on my cell phone and asked if I was certain someone was inside. I confirmed that I had been in the room with a man for several minutes, though I never saw his face. I mentioned that he had asked me to leave, so I respected his request, despite our usual procedure. Concerned, my supervisor instructed me to check the room again. Together, the morgue technician and I made our way back to the freezer room. I scanned my card, opened the door, and there was no one there. The room was empty. No man, no body, no clipboard, nothing. It was as if the scene I had witnessed just moments ago had never existed. The technician quickly completed his task, and as he was leaving, I couldn't help but share my experience with him. He seemed skeptical, but I knew what I had seen. My coworkers later teased me, thinking I was just seeing things or imagining it all. But I know that wasn't the case. Looking back, I'm convinced I encountered something supernatural that night. The whole experience was too strange, too quiet, too unsettling. The man's eerie voice, his refusal to turn around, the way he simply vanished, it all still gives me chills. That night changed the way I saw my job in the hospital. It reminded me that sometimes, we encounter things that can't be easily explained. And even when no one believes you, you know in your heart that what you experienced was real. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.